Chapter 25, The Enchantress. "Oh, how can I prove my innocence now?" exclaimed Richard, wringing his hands and walking hastily up and down the cell. "How shall I convince the world that a fearful combination of circumstances has so entangled me in this net that never was man so wronged before? How can I communicate my dread position to Monroe? How ever again look society in the face? How live after this exposure, this disgrace?" Master Richard," cried the poor old butler, "don't take on so, don't now. Your innocence must conspire on the day of trial, and the jury will do you justice. Now don't take on so, Master Richard, pray don't." As the faithful domestic uttered these words, the tears chased each other so rapidly down his cheeks that he seemed to need consolation quite as much as his master. "Oh, that villain Chichester, the wretch, the cheat," continued Richard, "and no doubt his vulgar companion Talbot is as bad, and the baronet, perhaps he also." Markham stopped short, and seated himself upon the bench. He suddenly became very faint, and turned ashy pale. Whittingham hastened to loosen his shirt-collar, and the policeman present humanely procured a glass of water. In a few minutes he recovered, and he then endeavored to contemplate with calmness the full extent of the perils which environed him. His opinion of Chichester and Talbot was already formed, but the baronet, could he have been a party to their scheme of villainy? After a moment's reflection, he answered the question to himself in an affirmative. He had then fallen into a nest of adventurers and swindlers, but Diana, oh no, she could not have been cognizant of the treacherous designs practiced against him. She was doubtless made use of as an instrument to further the plans of the conspirators. Such were his convictions. Should he then give her due warning in time and afford her an opportunity of abandoning, ere it might be too late, an individual who would doubtless involve her in the long run in infamy and peril? To pen a hasty note to Mrs. Arlington was now a duty which he conceived entailed upon him, and which he immediately performed. He then wrote a letter to Mr. Monroe, detailing the particulars of his unfortunate position, and beseeching him not to be prejudiced against him by the report which he might read in the newspapers the following day. "Whittingham, my old friend," said Markham, when he had disposed of these matters, "we must now separate for the present. This letter from Mr. Monroe you will forward by post. The other to Mrs. Arlington you will take yourself to Bond Street and deliver into her own hand." Then, addressing himself to McChisel, he observed, "I thank you, sir, for your attendance here today. Whittingham will give you the address of my guardian, Mr. Monroe, and that gentleman will consult with you upon the proper course to be pursued. He will also answer any pecuniary demands you may have occasion to make upon him." Richard had preserved an unnatural degree of calmness as he uttered these words, and Whittingham was himself astonished at the coolness with which his young master delivered his instructions. Richard's growing up. The old butler wept bitterly when he took leave of Master Richard, and it cost the young man himself no inconsiderable effort to restrain his own tears. "What is really your inferential opinion in this matter?" demanded the butler of the lawyer, as they issued from the door of the police office together. "Why, that it was a capital scheme to raise the wind, and a very great pity that it did not succeed to a far greater extent," cried the professional adviser. "Well, if you put down that opinion in your bill and charge 6 and 8 pence for it," said Whittingham with a very serious countenance, "I shall certainly dispute the item and computate it when I audit the accounts." "I am really at a loss to comprehend you," said the lawyer. "Of course there are no secrets between you and me. Indeed, you had much better tell me the whole truth." "Truth?" said Whittingham. "Of course I shall tell you the truth." "Allow me to ask a question or two, then," resumed the lawyer. "I suppose that you were in the plant and divided the swag." Mr. Whittingham stared at the professional man with the most unfeigned astonishment, which, indeed, was so great that it checked all reply. "Well," proceeded the shrewd Mr. McChisel, "it wasn't a bad dodge, either, and I suppose that this Monroe is a party to the whole concern." "Is it possible, Mr. McChisel," exclaimed the butler, but the business is awkward, very awkward," added the solicitor, shaking his head. "It was, however, fortunate that nothing transpired to implicate you also. When one pal is at large, he can do much for another who is in lavender." "It would have been worse if you had been lumbered too, far worse." "Lavender?" repeated Whittingham, with considerable emphasis on each word as he slowly uttered it. "I suppose you really think my master is guilty of the crime computed to him?" "Of course I do," replied McChisel. "I can see as far into a brick wall as anyone." "Well, if it's of no use argufying the point," said the butler, after a moment's pause, "here is Mr. Monroe's address. Perhaps when you have seen him you will arrive at new conclusions." Mr. Whittingham then took leave of the solicitor and proceeded to Bond Street. Oh, poor Richard. Even his lawyer thinks he's guilty, and he's not. Oh. Within a few yards of the house in which Mrs. Arlington resided, the butler ran against an individual who, with his hat perched jauntily on his right ear, was lounging along. "Hello, you fellow," said Mr. Tom Suggett, for it was he. "What do you mean by coming bolt against a gentleman in that kind of way?" "Oh, my dear sir," cried Whittingham, "is that you? I am really perforated with delight to see you." Perforated with delight. Mr. Suggett gave a good long stare at Mr. Whittingham and then exclaimed, "Oh, it is you, is it? Well, I must say that your legs are in a very unfinished condition." "How, sir? How?" demanded the irritated butler. "Why, they want a pair of fetters, to be sure," said Suggett, and breaking into a hoarse laugh, he passed rapidly on. Whittingham felt humiliated, and the knock that he gave at the door of Diana's lodgings was sneaking and subdued. In a few minutes, however, he was ushered into a back room on the first floor, where Mrs. Arlington received him. "Here is a letter, ma'am, which I was to deliver only into your identical hand." Is it from your master?" demanded the enchantress. "It is, ma'am." "Where is Mr. Markham?" asked Diana, receiving the letter with a trembling hand. "He is now in Bow Street Police Office, ma'am. In the course of the day he will be in Newgate," and the old butler wiped away a tear. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Diana. "Then it is really true." She immediately tore open the letter and ran her eyes over the contents, which were as follows. "The villainy of one of the individuals with whom you are constantly associating, and in whom it has been my misfortune to place unlimited confidence, will perhaps involve you in an embarrassment similar to the one in which I am now placed. I do not for one moment imagine that you are in by way conversant with these vile schemes. I can read your heart. I know that you would scorn such a confederacy. Your frankness, your candor are in your favor. Your countenance, which is engraven upon my memory, and which I behold at this moment as if it were really before me, forbids all suspicions injurious to your honor. Take a timely warning, then. Take warning from one who wishes you well, and dissolve the connection ere it be too late. R.M. Richard Markham. "When shall you see your master again?" inquired Diana of the butler, after the perusal of this letter. "Tomorrow, ma'am, with the blessing of God." "My compliments to him, my very best remembrances," said Mrs. Arlington, "and I feel deeply grateful for this communication." Whittingham bowed and rose to depart. "And," added Diana after a moment's pause, "if there be anything in which my humble services can be made available, pray do not hesitate to come to me. Indeed, I hope you will call often, and let me know how this unfortunate business proceeds." "Then you don't believe that Master Richard is capable of this obliquity, madam?" cried the butler. "Oh, no, impossible," said Diana emphatically. "Thank ye, ma'am, thank ye," exclaimed Whittingham. "You have done my poor old heart good." "God bless you, ma'am, God bless you." And with these words the faithful dependent took his departure, not a little delighted to think that there was at least one person in the world who believed in the innocence of Master Richard. In fact, the kindness of Diana's manner and the sincerity with which she had expressed herself on that point effectually wiped away from the mind of the butler the reminiscences of Macchisel's derogatory suspicions and Suggett's impertinence. After a few minutes' profound reflection, Diana returned to the drawing-room where Sir Rupert Harborough, Mr. Chichester, and Talbot were seated. Her fine countenance wore an expression of melancholy seriousness, and there was a nervous movement of the underlip that denoted the existence of powerful emotions in her bosom. "Well, Di," exclaimed the baronet, "you seem annoyed." "You will be surprised, gentlemen, when I inform you who has been here," she said, resuming her seat upon the sofa. "Indeed," cried Chichester, turning pale. "Who could it be?" "Not an officer, I hope," exclaimed the baronet. "The chimney sweep, perhaps?" suggested Mr. Talbot. Chimney sweep. "A person from Mr. Markham," said Diana seriously. "By his appearance I should conceive him to be the faithful old servant of his family, of whom I have heard him speak." "Whittingham, I'll be bound," said Chichester. "And what did he want?" "He brought me a letter from his master," returned Diana. "You may read it, if you please." And she tossed it contemptuously toward Chichester. "Read out," cried Talbot. Mr. Chichester read the letter aloud, as he was requested. "And what makes the young spark write to you in that impudent and familiar style?" demanded the baronet angrily. "You cannot but admit that his letter is couched in a most friendly manner," said the lady, somewhat bitterly. "Friendly be hanged," cried the baronet. "I dare say you feel a most profound and sisterly sympathy for the young jailbird. And after all, your profuse expenditure and extravagance helped to involve me in no end of pecuniary trouble, and I was compelled to have recourse to any means to obtain money. Somebody must suffer, better Markham than any one of us." "Oh, I don't like these guys." You do well, sir, to reproach me for being the cause of your embarrassments, answered Diana, her countenance becoming almost purple with indignation. Have I not basely lent these rooms to your purposes, and acted as an attraction to the young men whom you have inveigled here to plunder at cards? I have never forgiven myself for the weakness which prompted me thus far to enter into your schemes, but when you informed me of your plans relative to the forged notes, I protested vehemently against so atrocious a measure. Indeed, had it not been for your solemn assurance that you had abandoned the idea, at all events so far as it concerned Markham, I would have placed him upon his guard in spite of your threats, your menaces, and your remonstrances. Diana had warmed as she proceeded, and by the time she reached the end of her reply to the baronet's villainous speech, she had worked herself up almost into a fury of rage and indignation. Her bosom heaved convulsively, her eyes dilated, and her lips expressed an ineffable scorn. Perdition! Exclaimed the baronet. The world is coming to a pretty pass when one's own mistress undertakes to give lessons in morality. Oh, I really don't like these guys. A desperate necessity, sir, retorted Diana, made me your mistress, but I would sooner seek an asylum in the workhouse this moment than become a partner in villainy of this stamp. You go, Diana. And as far as I care, said the baronet, you may go to the workhouse as soon as you choose. With these words, he rose and put on his hat. Diana was about to answer this last brutal speech, but she determined not to provoke a discussion which only exposed her to the insolence of the man who was coward enough to reproach her with a frailty which had ministered to his pleasures. She bit her lips to restrain the burst of emotions which struggled for vent, and at that moment her bearing was as haughty and her aspect as proud as the superb dignity of incensed Juno. Come, Chichester, said the baronet after a pause of a few minutes. I shall be off. Talbot, this is no longer a place for any of us. Madam, he added, turning with mock ceremony to Diana, I wish you a very good afternoon. This is the last time you will ever see me in these apartments. I wish it to be so, said Diana, still stifling her rage with difficulty. And I need scarcely observe, exclaimed the baronet, that after all that has passed between us— Oh, I comprehend you, sir, interrupted the enchantress scornfully. You need not fear me. Your secrets are safe in my possession. The baronet bowed and strode out of the room, followed by Chichester and Talbot. The enchantress was then alone. Come on, Diana, you gotta do something to help Richard. Oh, I don't even know what she can do, though. Women had such little influence with the law. She threw herself at full length upon the sofa and remained for a long time buried in profound thought. A tear started into her large blue eye, but she hastily wiped it away with her snowy handkerchief. From time to time, her lips were compressed with scorn, and then a prolonged sigh would escape her breast. Had she given a free vent to her tears, she would have experienced immediate relief. She endeavored to stifle her passion, and it nearly suffocated her. But how beautiful was she during that painful and fierce struggle with her feelings. Her countenance was flushed, and her eyes, usually so mild and melting, seemed to burn like two stars. No, she exclaimed after a long silence, I must not revenge myself that way. Up to the present moment I have eaten his bread and have been to him as a wife, and I should be guilty of a vile deed of treachery were I to denounce him and his companions. Oh, come on, Diana. Besides, who would believe my testimony, unsupported by facts, against the indignant denial of a man of rank, family, and title? I must stifle my resentment for the present. The hour of retribution will no doubt arrive sooner or later, and Harborough shall yet repent the cruel, the cowardly insults he has heaped upon my head this day. I feel like that's foreshadowing. I hope that day of retribution comes in time to save Richard. She paused and again appeared to reflect profoundly. Suddenly a gleam of satisfaction passed over her countenance, and she started up to a sitting posture on the sofa. The ample skirts of her dress were partly raised by her attitude and revealed an exquisitely turned leg to the middle of the swell of the calf. The delicate foot, imprisoned in the flesh-colored stocking of finest silk, tapped upon the carpet in an agitated manner with the tip of a glossy leather shoe. The gleam of satisfaction which had suddenly appeared upon her countenance gradually expanded into a glow of delight, brilliant and beautiful. Oh, I hope she has a plan. Perhaps he thinks that I shall endeavor to win him back again to my arms, she said, musing aloud. Perhaps he imagines that his countenance and support are imperatively necessary to me. Oh, no, Sir Rupert Harborough, she exclaimed with a smile of triumph. You may vainly await self-humiliation from me. Tomorrow, yes, so soon as tomorrow, shall you see that I can command a position more splendid than the one in which you placed me. Obeying the impulse of her feelings, she hastened to unlock an elegant rosewood writing desk, edged with silver, and from a secret drawer she took several letters, or rather notes, written upon paper of different colors. Upon the various envelopes were seals impressed with armorial bearings, some of which were surrounded by coronets. Oh, so this is like aristocracy. She glanced over each in a cursory manner, which showed she was already tolerably familiar with their contents. The greater portion she tossed contemptuously into the fire. A few she placed one upon the other, quite in a businesslike way, upon the table. When she had gone through the entire file, she again directed her attention to those which she had reserved, and as she perused them, one after the other, she mused in the following manner. Count de Lestrange is brilliant in his offers and immensely rich. No doubt, but he is detestably conceited and would think more of himself than of his mistress. His appeal must be rejected. And she threw the French nobleman's perfumed epistle into the fire. This, she continued, taking up another, is from Lord Templeton. 5,000 a year is certainly handsome, but then he himself is so old and ugly. Away with this suitor at once. The English peer's billet doux followed that of the French count. Here's a beautiful specimen of calligraphy, resumed Diana, taking up a third letter, but all the sentiments are copied word for word out of the love scenes in Anne Radcliffe's romances. So someone wrote her like a love letter, but they had just copied it out of a romance novel. I don't recommend that. Never with such gross plagiarism. He merits the punishment I thus inflict upon him. And her plump white hand crushed the epistle ere she threw it into the fire. But what have we here? Oh, the German baron's killing address, interspersed with remarks upon the philosophy of love. Ah, my lord, love was not made for philosophers, and philosophers are incapable of love, so we will have none of you. Another offering to the fire. Ah, this seems as if it were to be the successful candidate, said Diana, carefully perusing the last remaining letter. It is written upon a plain sheet of white paper, and without scent. But then the style, how manly! Yes, decidedly, the Earl of Warrington has gained the prize. He is rich, unmarried, handsome, and still in the prime of life. There's no room for hesitation. The enchantress immediately penned the following note. I should have replied without delay to your lordship's letter of yesterday week, but have been suffering severely from cold and bad spirits. The former has been expelled by my physician. The latter can only be forced to decamp by the presence of your lordship. And she signed it, Diane Arlington. Having dispatched this note to the Earl of Warrington, the enchantress retired to her bedroom to prepare her toilette for the arrival of the nobleman around whom she had thus suddenly decided upon throwing her magic spells. At 8 o'clock that evening, a brilliant equipage stopped at the door of the house in which Mrs. Arlington resided. The Earl of Warrington alighted and was forthwith conducted into the presence of the enchantress, and never was she more bewitching, never had she appeared more transcendently lovely. Diana became the mistress of the Earl of Warrington, and the very next day removed to a splendid suite of apartments in Albemarle Street, while his lordship's upholsterers furnished a house for her reception. Okay, so Diana, that's the end of the chapter. Diana has figured out a new place for herself, but she seems to have forgotten all about Richard, and she's moved. So if the butler wanted help from her again, he won't even know where to find her. Is no one going to help Richard? Someone needs to help Richard. Okay, we'll see what happens tomorrow in chapter 26.